Roger, Roger. We have a mystery to unfold, detectives, and that's concerning the major reboot to the series, Star Wars Battlefront, from EA and DICE Studios. You see, this newer series has been fairly maligned, critically, and amongst the player base for a multitude of reasons, but sometimes those details get lost over time, especially as revisionist history starts to take hold, and nostalgia is put to the sword as the anti-critique. Star Wars Battlefront first launched in 2015 to a rather lukewarm response. It would be updated up until a sequel, Star Wars Battlefront 2, would drop in 2017. Both titles share similar gameplay, as players would take control of a particular soldier or hero unit and must complete a series of objectives depending on what game mode you would play, against enemies including the same. The previous two original titles that launched back in 2004 and 2005 are considered amongst online gaming royalty and, well, classics. These two newer titles in the series were larger disappointments because of this, despite selling quite well at a combined 33 million units. It's an interesting case, but I am the detective for the job. I am Ines, and I am the lead detective on the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or process of dying, utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, developer testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction, where we, as classic detectives do, crack the case for good. You know, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. As a super Star Wars fan, and such a big Battlefront fan, I bought both of the newer titles, yes, I know, grown away. Regardless, I'm quite excited to cover this intriguing story. Pick your class, and let's get to the next objective to capture in this Star Wars Battlefield-like action shooter. The story begins after EA had acquired the exclusive rights to make Star Wars games from Disney. Thanks, Disney. Back in 2013. Fairly shortly after that, EA announced their intentions to make another Battlefront game. But the clues might have been the earliest we have seen yet in the series, as many quality quotes were penned during this time coming from EA Executive Vice President Patrick Sutherland, former DICE CEO. This is DICE's interpretation of what Battlefront should be. That's the best description you can have. There are absolutely things in the previous Battlefront games that you'll recognize and remember, but DICE wants to put its own flavor on it. That's the only way we can do it. Hence it's called Star Wars Battlefront, without a 3 at the end. We want to say it's something new, but again, it's going to be very Star Wars and very cool. We don't want Star Wars plus Battlefield because that would be boring, right? Now, both of these Patricks here are, well, wizards, especially Patrick Sutherland, when it comes to saying a lot and saying a whole lot of nothing. But I think through the corporate lingo nonsense, you can see some interesting tidbits in this press release. Clues, if you will. First, he rightfully establishes this is a different studio handling the game, which is fine, but then specifies they are making Battlefront explicitly to their vision, though it will share some similarities of the previous game, which is a fairly generic claim since they are the same style of game. After making a point to explain the game is actually a reboot of the series, Patrick would end the statement with saying nothing much of note there. Another Patrick would jump in and add that, well, they don't want Battlefront to just be Star Wars plus Battlefield, while denigrating the idea in the same sentence. That's what Battlefront is. It's more arcadey, sure, but it's a Star Wars version of Battlefield. They share a lot of similarities. I mean, both games used the Conquest mode for starters originally, and if you don't think they share a lot more similarities, check out things like EA's version of Battlefront playing a lot like Battlefield 1, because it was built on the same engine. You can't remove the associations with these series, and doing so in an offhand way feels both dismissive and trying to remove the standards or expectations placed on you in your upcoming game, which wasn't a good sign of things to come. Before we move on from this, I want to address the elephant in the room, immediately. And that's that, inevitably, this 2-game series is going to be compared to the original game series, from Pandemic Studios under LucasArts back in 2004 and 2005. An arcade Star Wars shooter that also had a successful multiplayer. I think many who never played these games are quick to dismiss them as, well, nostalgia experiences that are overrated. But not only can you still play these games today on private servers, they are still popular and extremely well rated and regarded as a series. I won't go too into the development details concerning these interesting and iconic Star Wars games, but I do need to cover the base concepts and gameplay so we know what people were used to as an expectation for such a game in the future, such as myself, a massive fan of both of these games. Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2 were extremely similar games, featuring basically the same gameplay, minus changes to sprint, proning, and the addition of heroes you could play as. They even both had quality campaigns where you played as a soldier in the historical campaign or war, such as a Republic clone, or like a soldier in the 501st, aka Vader's Legion. And then the Galactic Conquest mode was awesome, which allowed players to essentially transform the game into a board game of sorts, with players getting to choose their era of conflict and faction. It then becomes a full turn-based board game where players must attempt to control all planets on the galaxy map. The second game would upgrade this fan-beloved mode and my personal favorite game mode in the game with the addition of a credit system and economy, and the ability to buy classes, a new fleet, or bonuses. These games came with full campaigns, fully playable offline modes, 16 then 24 maps for the sequel, followed by 9 more maps with DLC. And the crazy part, you played the game in multiple phases. First you had a standard conquest game mode where players must capture objectives and try to lower their opponent's tickets or lives. So for example, you would have Kashyyyk as the ground map. But then there was a space battle portion as well, where players must jump into a starfighter and attempt to attack the enemy capital ship from either outside the ship with your ship or from the inside. This meant you could fly into the airlock of a capital ship and make your way to key areas of the ship that you could disable for massive advantages. This as a concept back then was crazy. The segments of ground and space were split, sure, but they were at least combined during the space portions, which was absolutely innovative for the time. These two games would sell about 12 million copies combined, which was incredible for the time, but the legacy that Battlefront as a game and series created was immeasurable. It wasn't just a Battlefield spin-off anymore, it managed to become so much more, strengthened by the Star Wars IP heavily. But not just that, it was just, these were good games. Now that actually wasn't the last Battlefront game in the series. Well, sort of. Free Radical Design, a video game developer that was tasked with making, just that, a sequel, Battlefront 3, would try that, but then that game would tragically be cancelled back in 2008, though not totally die, as it would then be repurposed in assets and modified by UK-based developer Rebellion Developments for the Elite Squadron series, which would drop 2 more technically considered Battlefront games on the PSP and then DS. Though the quality of the series really hurt these handheld spin-offs in terms of expectations, as fans would think that they were just barely upgraded versions of Battlefront 2, which also had a PSP version by the way, but the games would struggle due to poor controls on both consoles, with things like space dogfighting being basically unplayable and a waste of time according to Eurogamer. But the multiplayer controls, maligned or not, was a beauty. And I know that sounds random as hell, but it's because Elite Squadrons was built on the remains of the cancelled third Battlefront game, which meant now they had a fully innovative multiplayer that allowed players to go from ground to space to capital ship interiors now. And again, sure, these are separated in some ways, but all you needed was a ship to fly to the next layer. This was done in a brilliant way that cuts away to the loading screen that you can't really see during space travel, allowing you to transition almost seamlessly from ground to space, something many fans were hoping to see someday on a major console or PC release, with everything just about scaled up. But the last Battlefront game or Elite Squadron game would come out in 2009, and following this, all the focus in the Star Wars universe was poured into a kind of massive multiplayer online RPG, Star Wars The Old Republic. One of my most played and most hated and loved online RPGs, which dropped back in 2011. A story we already covered on the channel, though it continues to hobble around. Simply put, Star Wars games after LucasArts was shuttered by Disney back in 2013 were in a bad spot. They weren't getting active game development anymore for the most part, and EA's announcement of a new Battlefront game, though, was supposed to change that. EA would unveil Battlefront 1 at their E3 showcase in the summer of 2014, though the trailer wouldn't feature any combat and instead was more of a teaser of sorts. We did learn that the project would be led by an experienced Battlefield 4 dev, despite their earlier statements, Nicholas Fagreus, who would go on to lead development on Battlefield 5, one of the more disliked games in the series as well. But considering he was one of 2 for the Battlefield franchise, that's not so bad, right? But since we have the gift of hindsight, we can say that choosing such a Battlefield-centric team to lead Battlefront was and would be problematic, because eventually EA would want them to make another Battlefield game, one of their cash cows. More details would be revealed in the spring of 2015, including the shooter being playable by up to 40 players online, with local split-screen missions that you could play offline. But these offline missions were not campaign, and according to IGN, campaign would not be included for the first time in the series' history. We also know that EA, or DICE Studios' Battlefront, will contain AT-ATs, speeder bikes, and starships, and include locations such as Endor, Hoth, Tatooine, and Sullust. A demo was also showcased that finally allowed players a glimpse of Star Wars Battlefront on DICE's Frostbite engine, typically used for Battlefield games of course. In this demo, critics watched gameplay concerning 40 players on a mode dubbed Walker Assault. Vagreus would then make an erroneous claim, saying Battlefront was first and foremost a multiplayer game. Now maybe he just means his version of Battlefront, but the original Battlefronts have well-regarded campaigns. No amount of revisionist history will change that, and all of the questions concerning that demo were passed on by DICE, interestingly enough. In a bizarre press release, the same day would be DICE's announcement of a free DLC titled Battle of Jakku. Now I think this is weird because it's strange it wasn't included in the base game, but we have a reason for why. According to sources, DICE was unable to include the tie-in for the new set of movies in Star Wars until they had actually been established as movies first. That's why the newer era of locations and characters and lore and all that from the new trilogy weren't included in the first Battlefront game. The catch being if you pre-ordered Battlefront, you would get access to it a week early as well. Having post-content was expected, a post-content tie-in especially. But I couldn't help but feel strange about the update regardless if it was made due to Disney or not. Beta for Star Wars Battlefront would start on October 8th, 2015, and carry on for about 5 days or so. The beta included Walker Assault, Drop Zone, and Survival Mission modes. Drop Zone is an 8 vs 8 infantry-only mode where players must fight control escape pods that drop to the surface. Survival was a similar concept, but played solo or in co-op instead, and designed more like a horde mode of sorts. But what the heck was Walker Assault? Where was the Conquest game mode or Capture the Flag? Walker Assault was the game's new flagship mode at the time, featuring up to 40 players, 20 vs 20, where the Empire must march their AT-AT walkers towards the Rebel base, and the Rebels must defend. Which basically played like the Rush mode did in Battlefield, minus the ticket system, which just made it more of like a meat grinder of a mode until you reached the next objective basically. As a beta tester during this time, the gameplay and visuals were fantastic in the rebooted Battlefront, far exceeding what was accomplished beforehand, for sure. But I was really worried about the content offered in the games, including the lack of single-player campaign, and, well, how underwhelming Walker Assault was for me. Regardless of the tepid reception from hardcores like myself and positive reception elsewise, the beta would go on to be EA's most successful yet, reaching a whopping 9.5 million plus players, which is just insane, and shows the strength of Battlefront and the Star Wars IP. And sure, we give Disney shit for reportedly making EA schedule their Battlefront releases with the upcoming trilogy releases, or maybe they didn't and just EA chose to do that, but that likely also led to the craze summoned up for Battlefront, as many fans were also awaiting the new movies to drop. Star Wars Battlefront would launch November 17th, 2015, 10 years after the second game in the first series had made its mark on the world in a major way, and despite all the hype in the world, what came next for the reboot was a bit of a letdown. Battlefront would only manage to score a 73 out of 100 from 60 different critics, which wasn't a good sign when you can't score well with a major IP, with tons of money with the critics as well, if you catch my drift. For reference, the original Battlefronts scored an 81.5 on average between the two of them. Players have rated the game much worse, however, with some ratings being as low as 5.2 out of 10, where many fans, myself included, felt the game put all its money into the production, gunplay, and visuals, and not a whole lot else. Sure, with the introduction of the Horde mode to the series in the form of Survival, that was a great addition, but what was meant to replace the classic Conquest mode, Supremacy, which seemed to be erected out of nowhere, with no publicity around it, which makes me think they made it as a concession of sorts, was not even fully like Conquest, as it was far more linear and structured in its approach, like Battlefield's Conquest mode of the same name. Supremacy was more like Escalation in Battlefield, if anything, but you can attack and capture any command point at any point of the game. But remember, with the handheld Elite Squadron Battlefront spin-off we mentioned earlier, that game had a Conquest mode, if you remember, that also allowed for 3 maps of play simultaneously, and it was playable on handheld. The reason we rejected Supremacy as a mode early on was because we never asked for it, at least not as the game's main mode. We wanted Conquest, and the idea that you could hand-wave that because you don't want Battlefront to be too much like Battlefield, is idiotic when the original Battlefronts featured the same mode, and it already was like it. Supremacy did nothing new or exciting, but don't get me started on the lack of single-player features and content in the game, overall. That's because I bought Battlefront at launch. Sorry, I'm a Star Wars fanboy. I have a problem. And even I couldn't steelman the game in that sense because when I tried to play the game offline, my only options were the game's horde mode, which I wasn't personally a fan of, or the game's training or battle missions, which were incredibly limited in the first place. In the AI, I mean, sheesh. I've gone back to playing the game since recording and writing this, and they get stuck on grass walls and on planets like Naboo, endlessly wander around Tatooine's maps, or instantly lock onto you randomly after playing like a complete, well, bot when fighting in space or on the ground. Sure, bad AI was kind of the norm for Battlefront as a series, let's be honest, but this was a moment for the game to shine and be different and unique. And it's ironic when DICE's next Battlefield game, 2042, would actually feature some pretty serviceable AI, something they would ultimately add to the second game as well. But when you offer so little offline, if you don't have good AI, people are going to complain. That's just simple math. Another thing severely lacking from Battlefront was space battles, something that would be shelved until a later content update. I know, a Battlefront game without space is like a Battlefield game without jets or helis. I want to be clear, there's a lot to love about Battlefront 1, or Battlefront, but it's an all-in-one or two categories for me, and that's the visual and sound design and presentation, aka production, and the game's gunplay, which feels like a mixture of grounded due to quality movement and arcadey due to the fact that you're shooting fictitious laser guns with projectiles. While you are limited by dodging only sideways, and that was added after the game's launch actually, which is kind of strange, the game has a more tactical feel due to this. In a sense, it feels more like it's about shooting than doing anything else. Seriously though, if you're a Star Wars fan and haven't experienced the first Battlefront's gameplay, you're missing out. It would end up changing a lot during the sequel. The best part about the gameplay in Battlefront to me was that it was class-based infantry combat, with the chance you could pick up a special vehicle or hero token on the battlefield littered throughout. This means you were more so focused on working with your teammates to complete objectives, and not just stat pad or do things to maximize how much credits per life you were earning. The issue with this system, which was silly to me, was that if you got hit while you were activating a token, it would randomly expire or disappear, which, I mean, come on, DICE. While I spent more time this video describing the gameplay and reception of the game myself due to me having played the game extensively, and, well, being a huge fan of the series, we still have to do our due diligence as detectives and make sure we cover the critical reception for the game too, which we mentioned some scores, but let's dive more into them with two big examples. Starting with the first one, with Forbes. Forbes would claim that, like a stormtrooper, DICE would miss the mark on Battlefront. Nice pun. Rating the game as 6.5 out of 10, where they would state that the game felt like a collection of minigames, hobbled together, lacking any classical shooter staple modes, like CTF, Conquest, or Deathmatch, essentially just being a glorified $60 one-game mode, and Walker Assault, which, to be honest, I think is fair criticism. But some critics would give the game a glowing review, despite the many glaring weaknesses and holes in it, such as IGN, and their incredibly positive 8 out of 10. Where they would state that Battlefront captured the essence of the original trilogy, which I assume is a claim about visuals and production, because it doesn't harness the most exciting moments in the game's series history, nor does it even cover most of them, with space literally not existing in the game, remember? If you read their actual review, they use words like unfocused filler and go as far to call it bad, concerning aspects and game modes in the game, while saying it also relies on extra modes to make up for the fact that it doesn't have a single player campaign. Sorry, I just don't see how we're arriving from those critiques to an 8 out of 10 game. The same rating they gave Borderlands 4, and Slay the Spire 2, and Monster Hunter Rise, games that offer far more offline content than Battlefront does, ironically. And no, saying the game is multiplayer focused for some corny reason doesn't change that expectation. Battlefront was painful as a major fan, because there were some good bones there, but that was about it. 10 years and no innovations or new bells and whistles, besides just looking and sounding really good. After their first free DLC, Battle of Jakku, which also introduced another game mode alongside it, though it just seemed like another Walker Assault and Turning Point, without the walkers this time, and, well, an added stopwatch, they would ship the DLC in that patch directly into the game, no longer needing it to be downloaded separately, which kind of proves my point earlier about it kind of being unnecessary. New maps were desperately needed though, as not all maps could be played with all modes, and there were only 9 maps in total at launch anyway. The Outer Rim update, which launched alongside the Outer Rim DLC, which is only reserved to those who would purchase the $15 DLC, the update would add an increased rank cap, revamped scoreboard, and added the ability to combat roll as a non-hero character. The DLC was where the meat of the actual update, our content was, and would remain, as they would never be opened up to standard map rotations or released for free. Outer Rim would have 4 new maps all based at Jabba's palace and surrounding area, new weapons, and a new mode. And 2 new heroes, of course, themed for the region, Greedo and Nien Nunb. This DLC would also introduce the much-loved extraction mode to the game, which was sort of like pushing the payload in Overwatch, but with the added effect of having special choke point hazards and the ability to play as a hero unit. Once a hero would die, they are out of the entirety of the round too. As much as I want to hate this DLC, and I do based on consumer practices, the Jabba Palace map and extraction mode were pretty beloved, including by me. Though I do think you can have a nuanced position of disliking how unfinished the game launched and enjoying what new content was brought to it, though making the decision to purchase it does mean you're enabling this kind of thing, at least a little bit. Coming as a shock to most, especially considering it was only 6 months after launching the first game, but before pitchforks go up too hard, Pandemic Studios did something similar with their original Battlefront series, but they managed to greatly upgrade the game and add another unique campaign alongside it, a higher bar. That would be the announcement of a sequel Battlefront, May 10th, 2016. According to EA CFO Blake Jorgensen, Battlefront 2 was set to feature bigger and better worlds, and that it would feature the new movie characters and IP for the first time. Jorgensen also claimed that they were looking to launch a new Star Wars game every year after that, for the next 3 to 4 years, with the next Battlefront game set to drop a year later, in 2017, which would of course coincide with the next movie release. In another press release, EA studio boss Patrick Soderlund would say that the lack of single-player campaign was a conscious decision, making the cut in Battlefront 1, according to them, due to the fact that they needed to launch alongside the newest trilogy in its first movie. Now the thing is, we don't know if that was EA or Disney's directive ultimately, but Soderlund did seem flippant about the criticism about the lack of single-player and other content, saying that although they weren't happy with their 75 rating, they see the game as a success due to the limitations had on it. And, I mean, look, here's the sad part about it all. He's kind of right from a business perspective especially. I mean, Battlefront 1 most likely didn't have a massive budget and definitely didn't have a lot of development time. It's missing features that the previous Battlefronts have. It does basically nothing to innovate compared to like even Elite Squadron. And yet, Battlefront's return and massive marketing push by EA, aided by Disney's push with the recent Star Wars movies, would manage to sell an incredibly impressive 14 million copies, which sadly has serious ramifications, because it meant that they were going to do it again, which they were already planning. Issues being, would the sequel be an answer to the problems or requests, or just a contractual game with a bit more shiny things added to it? And what's to say this game wouldn't feel the same level of rushed and missing a soul when they only had 2 years max to work on it? In order to increase their production scale and speed, EA would enlist in other studios such as Criterion Games and EA's Motive Studio, who we just covered on Star Wars Squadrons on the Death of a Game series, the latter studio not being one that I'm really so fond of. It wasn't exactly said who was going to be working on what, but we later know that Criterion would work on vehicles and starships, which, by the way, still weren't in the game, sequel announced or not, and Motive Studios would handle the game's upcoming campaign, which actually wasn't announced for another year, by the way, making it feel incredibly last minute, despite the obvious requests. The second expansion, or DLC, Bespin, would introduce, for another $15 of course, 5 new maps based on Bespin in an iconic location like Cloud City, alongside 2 new heroes in Lando and Dengar, quality mercenaries of course, and a new game mode dubbed Sabotage, where teams of 16 versus 16 compete against each other and must defend until their escape transport arrives. Now you might be wondering, why are there like 15 or 14 million different modes? And well, the simple answer is convenience. And I know that sounds strange, but hear me out. What I mean is it's easier to build a planet or major region as a place you build your maps from, for all different styles of game modes, instead of building them specifically for certain kinds of game modes and then having to adapt them. This makes for cool stylistic choices in the sense that the story and lore can feel connected in the expansions, but considering there isn't actually any story or effort put into the storytelling about the new characters or regions, it just feels like a cheap solution for them, though they would attempt to fix this with the sequel. Out of the 31 multiplayer maps, for example, only 11 were playable with the game's flagship mode, Walker Assault, and what would later become the game's flagship mode, Supremacy, which just makes it feel like a bit of a wasted effort, when the majority of people who enjoy Battlefront like the big maps and like the other modes, vehicles or not. But Extraction or Survival did manage to be positive additions, though they were sadly very underutilized. Arguably, one of the game's biggest updates period would be the Death Star update and expansion, which dropped September 20th, 2016. Now, to be fair, you don't need the $15 expansion to play space combat exactly, as you would only have access without the expansion to dogfights over a planet landscape, and if you did purchase it, you got access then to the Death Star space theme maps and some new heroes and boss R2-D2 and Chewbacca as well. The new mode, Battle Station, would introduce a multi-stage narrative focus for the first time, really. This was a game mode that was meant to mimic what it was like attacking the Death Star in Episode 4, A New Hope. You even got to fly through the tunnel system for a final torpedo launching sequence too. Epic. But some fans, such as myself, couldn't help but feel a bit cheated. I mean, why am I paying $15 for space content the first Battlefront had in 2004? It feels like I'm paying them to finish their game. Especially when many of the maps, as you would sort of expect, were sort of meat grinder close quarter battle zones. The value was just not there, no matter how much nostalgia would come in, because nostalgia has to work both ways. Battlefront's last update before the launch of the second game the following year would drop December 6th, 2016, titled for the beloved movie that released the same year. The Rogue One Scarif update would introduce a new rank increase, a few balance changes, but it was largely a DLC-only affair here, let's be honest, with the DLC introducing 4 new maps set on Scarif, and a new game mode in Infiltration, which again functions like many of the other new game modes added after the DLC. Though Infiltration was cool because it actually attempted to merge the space portion of the game with the ground portions of the game. Why this took them another year to implement, though, is nuts, especially when, once again, even if you like it, unless you never played Battlefront or hell, Battlefield, you wouldn't really be impressed by this. I mean, remember, a handheld game did this like 2 decades ago in the same series? But although they were being held at the fire for their lack of single-player campaign and, well, single-player features, DICE Studios would finally announce a campaign for their upcoming sequel in the spring of 2017. And alongside the announcement was the mention of 2 writers tasked for the job. Walt Williams, who wrote Marvel Midnight Suns and was a narrative director on Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which aren't really bad received story-wise, so maybe a good addition, but had previously not worked on any Star Wars games, nor even was a lead writer on any of the projects prior to the sequel Battlefront. The second writer, Mitchell Dyer, wait, what the same IGN writer who gave Battlefront a glowing review at 8 out of 10? No, seriously. It is. This is his first recorded gig we could find. And after this would go on to write Star Wars Squadrons as well, which we already covered and I wasn't really high on. Nor were many others. And then Gotham Knights. Yes, the Gotham Knights that people hated. How on earth you go from glazing a game to writing the second game, I have no idea, but I will let your detective minds roam free with your own theories. I will say that it blows my mind that in no career I have ever seen otherwise can you go from a bad project performance to a bigger and better project. Yes, art needs time to develop, like how bad my early videos are in many ways, but the content was there, right? Which is more of what we're talking about here. I just think that the bar of storytelling in video games was incredibly low, and part of that comes from hiring people who aren't traditionally writers, with nearly no gaming experience or aptitude. The beta for the sequel would drop just a month before launch, guaranteeing just about nothing was going to be fixed by then. But this beta did contain more than just the first games, introducing Galactic Assault, which seemed to replace Walker Assault, and of course there was Supremacy, which was already there before but seemed to get a bit more love here with some changes. The biggest upgrade to Supremacy, and well the game in general, coming in the form of the inclusion of the Starfighter Assault mode and, well, Starfighters. But Starfighter Assault was unique. It was a 12 versus 12, where players could play with up to 20 extra AI-controlled ships, with multiple phases ending in you destroying or defending a Star Destroyer. If anything, this was the basis of what would later become a separate game in Star Wars Squadrons, which was obviously a MOBA-inspired multiplayer mode, and despite just being about dogfighting, was pretty positively received, especially with such a drought of space content in the Star Wars gaming universe. The reception of the beta was much more positive than the first in terms of critical opinions, though it also didn't include what would later become a massively controversial microtransaction-riddled progression system, allowing this to slip by for a few more weeks. Well, it didn't include the purchasable parts, I should say, but some experienced video game critics such as Destiny's own Paul Tassia Forbes would warn players of what was potentially to come, where he would make the argument that these loot boxes added to the game, according to EA, to make up for the free content they were releasing for the game, such as the DLC maps and post-launch content no longer being, $15 or whatever and being released for free, it would become pay to win, as these boxes would basically be needed for proper progression. such as star cards, which gave you unique abilities and passive bonuses that could be straight flat damage upgrades and even more. During the game's early access release for subscribers of EA Access or Origin Access programs, players were able to further mine details concerning this upcoming progression system, though the game wasn't even fully released during this time, which is absurd. Pre-ordering for a demo that's not even the full version of the game yet? But anyway, in fact, this is where the majority of the pushback would stem from for the microtransactions in Battlefront 2. The community would band together, with individual detectives making scary discoveries concerning the new monetization system, such as the Hotter Potato, for example, who would create a spreadsheet concerning how many credits you could earn after each match, and how long this progression would take to unlock, say, a hero or villain in the game, the unique playable characters, based on the iconic heroes and villains from Star Wars, of course. That number was 40 hours, 60,000 credits, and 40 hours of saving those credits would allow you to buy one hero. And that's not counting the massive requirement to master every star card in the game, the perk giving cards you unlocked, which would reportedly take as long as 4,500 hours of gameplay. So unless you spent copious amounts of money and welcome gambling into your life, you couldn't even outright purchase villains such as Darth Vader. After spending $90, Polygon determined they weren't even halfway to unlocking a single hero for a full-price game. This was absolutely bonkers. And this wasn't even the end of it though. A few days later, and they would drop a special starter pack that would cost $15 and only included the currency in the game. EA's initial reaction to this was an attempt to hand-wave things as normal, where they would relate the new progression system to a sense of pride and accomplishment that would go with it for unlocking the new heroes. This comment would go on to be one of the most downvoted comments on Reddit of all time, at 667,000 downvotes, after a conversation EA CEO Andrew Wilson would have with Disney CEO Bob Iger, where reportedly the former would get a bit of a spanking. EA would then make the announcement just hours before the game's global launch that they would be removing microtransactions for the near future, while they would be redoing the monetization and progression systems. And look, I get it. You can't design a live service around giving content away for free if you aren't going to continue to make more money, especially not in this day and age with a multiplayer title. But that usually applies to free games, and replacing DLC with forced microtransactions that affected everyone in the game was just a bargain not many were willing to make, and frankly speaking, a bargain they shouldn't have to make because these games still cost full price and they should be launching largely complete anyway. Star Wars Battlefront 2 would drop November 17th, 2017, globally for all players who purchased the base game, where it would struggle to make the same impact critically with fans and even sales-wise as the predecessor did, only managing to score 68 out of 100 from 62 different critics on Metacritic, while the players would scoff at such a positive-seeming score, where they would instead torch the game at a 2 out of 10 from nearly 10,000 plus users. Now I want to start with the Polygon critical review concerning the game, which is fairly detailed, but I still found a lot questionable about its 6.5 out of 10 rating. For starters, the amount of glazing critics give the game's campaign almost worked on me even. I was finally believing I could play a good Star Wars campaign experience again. While Polygon calls the story literally repeating previous game stories, aka bad guy turned good guy or the Kyle Katarn, and relies heavily on a massive cameo in Luke Skywalker, calling it smart writing, okay. They at least acknowledge how stunted and unimaginative the gameplay in the campaign is, which had me personally falling asleep at times, as it's a forgettable campaign that has 5 to 7 hours of gameplay max. I mean, anyone who beat it, can you tell me anything about it besides Inferno Squad, Luke Skywalker, the Empire, and Iden Versio? Okay, I lied about the last one. That's the main character, and there's no chance you remember her. Polygon's take on multiplayer I will largely ignore, because it does nothing to acknowledge the previous game's gameplay or content, besides the changes to space combat now allowing you to use both sticks instead of one. I mean, these guys thought the officer role was useless in their review. Meanwhile, it was my main, and it's the #1 point farming role in the game. Their ultimate statement being, Star Wars Battlefront 2 is made up of many different parts that are pretty good, but the whole is consistently undermined by poor choices in the game's multiplayer economy. No aspect of Battlefront 2 is beyond redemption, but it's hard to fall in love with any part of it either. It's mostly a disjointed, sporadically fun collection of modes set in familiar Star Wars scenes. Because players have no idea what it's really being sold to them, or when, you have a big name launch that gets in the way of itself more than it creates any fun. Which, sorry, it just feels like cowtailing to the public opinion and reception at the time, more so than making a lasting critique. No aspect is beyond redemption. Well, I guess unless you played the first games and expect that the campaign would be better than those were, but besides pretty cinematics and cutscenes, that's just not true. But the most shocking critical reviews I would find is not necessarily due to the scoring regarding it, but due to one of the more interesting stories I have covered on this channel, and that's concerning the IGN review over Battlefront 2. That at the top of the review, which is, by the way, before I notice it in the credits, states that the last reviewer of Battlefront is now a co-writer on Star Wars Battlefront 2. While this might sound normal in isolation, Mitch Dyer didn't just review Battlefront 1, he glazed it more than almost any other major outlet did. That just feels a little bit weird, no? He gets hired after, despite no writing credits officially as the writer. Ultimately, the new IGN writer Tom Marks gives the game some positive words that feel more like being nice than anything else, when they say that the game does a lot right, and then only mention the production again as a positive, just like with the first game. And regarding the multiplayer, there isn't any acknowledgement, it's still bare bones as hell. I mean, they didn't even include any of the original maps at launch from the first game. Like, what are we doing here? But really, I guess the negative taste in my mouth concerning Battlefront 2's reception, despite largely being bad, is most seem to scapegoat the progression system as the only reason for that reception. But many of our critiques of the first game still stand here. It's the same bones, mostly, with modern Star Wars characters added to it now. Though I have to say, as a final comment on the differences between the first Battlefront and the second one by EA, is that I think that the gunplay is actually better in the first game, because it has a faster time to kill, and it just felt more weighty. Whereas in the second game, it feels a bit more arcadey, with the addition of rolling in all directions, a longer time to kill, and your projectiles from your blaster shooting more like just standard bullets now, which for me was worse, because it made the game feel less like a Star Wars Battlefront game, and more like a competitive battlefield shooter. Oh, and one last gameplay aspect we must cover before moving on, as it's the main difference in how you play at a base level in Battlefront 1 and 2. And that's, if you remember, in the first game, you only got hero or vehicle unlocks from tokens on the map, ones that would expire randomly when you would pick them up due to glitches or just being hit. Battlefront 2, on the other hand, was a full transition to a credit system economy, where players must earn credits to unlock special reinforcements or special hero or villain classes. The problem with this system is that it only really rewarded veterans of the series the most, who were able to quickly gain credits and make sure to keep the classes on lockdown, even heroes. At the worst of it, you would have the same players sitting in the lobby, kill screen, waiting for a new class cooldown to expire to respawn as them, which was just a dorky system in my eyes and never gave you as like a typical player the chance to play some of them. According to EA, their sales of Battlefront 2 had fallen short of expectations, managing to sell 9 million copies, well under the first game's copies sold in a similar time, and 1 million less than they wanted to sell reportedly. During an investor call, CEO Andrew Wilson would deny claims that the relationship between them and Disney was soured, and that they would eventually be adding back microtransactions to the game, especially since they aren't receiving any more revenue from the upcoming updates or DLC. EA would blame the loot box controversy, largely, for their launch woes, allowing developers like DICE Studios kind of to be able to skate by without any self-reflection. Brilliant. EA would respond to the massive community backlash with a full progression rework in the spring of 2018, the following year. The major changes being removal of heroes and star cards from the loot boxes, allowing star cards to be earned through gameplay, and heroes and villains already unlocked. While the premium crystal currency wouldn't be implemented until a few more weeks, Soderlund would admit that the backlash had affected them and that they were trying to learn from their mistakes. Which sounds great, of course, as a public speaker for a corporation should sound, but something in business is called a calculated risk. This is the idea that corporations, especially, for example, are quite in tune with knowing when something is risky or not, and oftentimes will take a calculated risk if they believe they can properly recover from said risk, from the pushback, or get none of it at all. EA might have been expecting a pushback, but none of this kind or variant, and not at this scale, that it alerted their boss Disney. The progression changes, though, were great overall in my opinion, and is when I started playing multiplayer personally. These changes were desperately needed to keep the game alive, even so early on in things, but although they would help things, they wouldn't likely bring back the players who were already too burnt on the game or scared off from that dark cloud surrounding the game, which is the right of a consumer after all. The squad system update would drop in the fall of 2018, and with it would be a revamping of the game's original spawn system, which was typically done in waves, now sharing Battlefield's squad spawning system instead, a much better improvement. The next major update we will cover on the Timeline Detectives is the Capital Supremacy update March 27th, 2019, which might be one of the best updates Battlefront 2 ever had in my opinion. Like the name would explain, it would introduce a new version of Supremacy, an upgraded version, the Capital Supremacy if you will, which would now add a tug-of-war multi-stage objective affair connected with the ability to also invade a capital ship. The big difference being the addition of up to 24 extra AI players, which might sound minor, but honestly is quite big because even recording footage for this video, we can see a lot more activity on the maps because of this, and it gives you a lot more winnable fights on the map, especially when you have to fight against like super grinders who have max level characters in Battlefront 2. Further maps would be reworked into also working with Supremacy as well, making it like the de facto flagship mode from this point on. The update also had a rework of the lightsaber combat system in the game, allowing it to not nearly be as clunky as it was before, and added a large-scale map in Geonosis. Just like the first game needed an update to allow normal multiplayer game modes to be playable offline, single player or co-op with the AI, the same would happen with Battlefront 2, September 2019, when they would allow Supremacy mode offline. Though it didn't weirdly enough also include the capital ship sequences, which tracks with the normal mode online to be fair, so perhaps they never figured out the AI on the capital ship. By November of 2019, the rebooted franchise had managed to sell 33 million units, though that means more so the units sold to retail than copies bought by players. Impressive nonetheless. But despite how it looked, wasn't a guarantee that more Star Wars games would come, especially with more Star Wars games planned with EA, with other studios, and their contract for exclusivity expiring later in 2023. Not to mention not taking in DLC and selling worse than the first Battlefront was going to make EA realize that they couldn't just print money with an incomplete product, which would likely scare them away with that kind of business, let's be honest. Battlefront 1 launched during the first movie, and Battlefront 2 launched during the second. And the third movie would have a coinciding update titled The Rise of Skywalker, and it would drop December 17th, 2019, adding a new map, and most importantly, in my eyes, expanding co-op to the modern Star Wars era. The Age of Rebellion update would introduce the Age of Rebellion, of course, to co-op, further expanding the offerings there too, as well as a slew of other typical changes, such as new weapons, balance changes, and more. But what would really come as a shocker to all involved, myself included, was the announcement that EA would make April 28th, 2020, concerning the future of the Battlefront series, and that was that EA would be shifting both Battlefront games, including the sequel, only 3 years old now, to maintenance mode, promising that no more new content would be coming out, and the team at DICE would be shifted to focus on Battlefront 2042, which was set to launch later the next year, which would actually suffer a similar fate, in that it would launch fairly unfinished and not in some totally working state, despite having some positive aspects about it. But no, seriously, the majority of the Battlefront team would go on to work on Battlefield 2042, and that wasn't a success critically, nor amongst the players. It's worth noting that the team that shipped Battlefront and Battlefield 2 were similar, but there were some major changes made for Battlefield 6, which sold much better than Battlefield 2042 and nearly as good as both Battlefronts combined. To be fair, the former team seemed to get absolutely no time to execute their game visions twice in a row, but it's no mystery they put a different head of development on Battlefield 6, rest in peace Vince Zappella, and had a largely different team overall too. The final update for Battlefront 2 would hit live April 29th, 2020, dubbed the Battle of Scarif, which would add the Age of Rebellion to instant action Supremacy and a new map to Scarif Beach, as well as further expanding the co-op mission set. Just a reminder, whenever the original Battlefront games came out, they didn't need to constantly have updates that would add old factions or new factions back to the old modes in the game. But the final update was a rather lean update, showing how much DICE Studios really had moved on. During the summer of 2020, they would make one last effort and launch both Battlefronts on Steam, something they would start routinely doing from that point on. The first Battlefront never quite caught on online despite me thinking it has better combat. The approach of the games were pretty different, let's be honest, and the hardcore players are more likely to enjoy the second game because it rewards them point whoring more and just being better players. Battlefront 2 wouldn't grow a very large Steam population either. I mean, hard to do that when you just told your fan base that you were moving on, right? The only people who would try it there were likely those who hadn't already quit the game before. But while Battlefront 2 wouldn't have much of a Steam population at first, that would change a number of years later during the summer of 2025, where after the prequels were reshown in theaters, a spike in popularity would then be fanned by some popular YouTubers and streamers such as Ackman 2. and these numbers were nothing to scoff at, reaching as high as 35,000 players peak and 12,000 players concurrently on average, which was nuts. This wasn't just because of the movies being re-released though. It was actually a community-led effort from Kyber, a custom game launcher that would drop into beta sometime in 2025. Kyber would then organize a major Resurgence Day event, encouraging players to log on Battlefront 2 to test the game with the new launcher. And since some players had purchased the game through Steam, that would explain the spike there. If you remember, Battlefront 2 was not cross-platform, meaning the audiences were heavily split. Worse, since the game was abandoned, hackers had found the ability to ruin entire games on top of things like admin privileges to kill the entire match or force a load screen on you, so a custom launcher in Kyber was pretty much needed for the time. And boy, did it deliver. Not only did it come with a custom launcher, you had a custom game browser, proximity voice chat, which is nuts, spectator mode, career stats, moderation tools for dealing with hackers or toxic players, and best of all in my eyes, custom mods, such as the famous Battlefront Plus mod, which really lives up to the name. It adds 21 new heroes to the game, 30 new reworked reinforcements, new weapons, and a ton more, like upgrades to the game's arcade modes, daytime and nighttime, variants to maps, and so much more. But at this point, according to all of my sources and detectives on the case, Kyber Launcher is where it's at and where the meat of the remaining Battlefront players remain. So if you're interested in playing the best Battlefront experience, you should probably go there. As of the summer of 2026, however, the Steam population for both games has heavily slowed, with the first barely reaching a couple dozen players peak, and the second at just over 2,000 players. When I attempted to play some specific modes while recording content for this video, I did also notice severe lag in my ability to find a match. No new announcements of any more Battlefront games have rung out either, though cries for such have definitely happened, even amongst the stars, leaving the franchise in a limbo, like many other titles in the Death of Game series, where it's stuck in maintenance mode just one step away from death. And so, detectives, the timeline has come to an end, and both Star Wars Battlefronts have been long abandoned by those involved in creating it. And so, in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, despite combining to sell nearly 36 million copies, fail to remain a franchise that EA trusted in further and would go back to? So much so that they would relegate both games to maintenance mode. Both games feel like high production demos or proofs of concept, lack of core series features, rushed launches to coincide with the movie releases, Battlefield 2042, pay-to-win progression, shifted to maintenance mode by the parent company, EA. I have such mixed feelings regarding this case, detectives. As much as I want to take DICE and EA to task, I very much spent the majority of this video already doing just that. I have to also acknowledge something serious. Imagine if they had just combined development for both of those games, as typical for a AAA development schedule, 4 years, and then released that game. I can't help but feel like that could have led to a lot more of a live service approach for them that they could have kept making content and money from, instead of trying to cash in and then having to cash out. Battlefront 1 and 2, the reboots combined, could have been something really special, containing nearly all eras of play, factions, and heroes. Instead, EA's insistence on turning a new golden goose, think a goose not quite used to laying eggs yet, had egged him dry before he had a chance to set up. I have to be honest here. I don't really trust EA with the Star Wars exclusive license, which they did technically lose like 3 years ago, but the games they put out during the time that they had it, while certainly able to sell well in many cases, were just nothing close to capturing the sense of wonder I got when playing Star Wars games as a kid. And no, that's not just nostalgia. Many of those games created and pioneered concepts that are either still popular today or haven't ever been beaten as a gaming concept, such as the original 4 Battlefronts. Thanks for watching, detectives, and let me know in the comments below what you thought about the rebooted Star Wars Battlefront series, or hell, even the old series, in case I missed any reasons the new series just didn't last longer than a few years.